Hello, welcome back to About Time. I'm Stephen, and I've been a Doctor Who fan since 2005. Normally I'm joined by my boyfriend Ben. Today, however, to discuss Lux, I'm joined by Willow. Hello, Willow.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me back.
Yeah, you've been on the podcast a couple of times before, haven't you, for 73 Yards and then Joy to the World.
But I've sort of regenerated because I went by Will back then, but I'm fully embracing a non-binary name of my choice.
Now you've bloomed into Willow.
Into Willow, yeah.
Yeah, amazing. And of course, a particular reason that you're on this episode, you laid your claim in this one quite early,
yes.
Because it's particularly aligned with your life and your interests and your work and everything, because you are an animator, aren't you?
Yeah, it was a very weird coincidence that the animated episode, as soon as I saw that in the trailer for this series, I immediately messaged you and said, that is my episode that I want to do. It only seems right as an animator and animation lover generally. And then the other funny thing is that episode happened to be the one that aired on my 30th birthday. So
perfect.
Very strange set of coincidences. But yeah, here I am.
Yes. And how are you finding being 30?
Very, very similar to being 29 and 360 however many days. But yeah, I mean, my wife turned 30 6 months before me. So she, we had that in the household anyway. And then it was just a case of me catching up, really. Yeah.
But so Ben just turned 33 and I'm going to be doing the same in a few weeks. You get to that age where birthdays are just they're just another day, really, aren't they? You just kind of get on with it.
Yeah. I mean, I was very fortunate to get a lot of books. Most of them, in fact, were the Target novelizations. I know we've spoken about that on Instagram a little bit, some of our favourite ones. And I'm actually looking forward to, because Lux itself is going to be novelised, and I'm looking forward to seeing how they're going to do that, because obviously it being so visual.
Yes.
But I'm sure we'll get into that.
Well, yes. Shall we dive in then? So are you enjoying the series so far?
I think, yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of RTD2, his certain approach to it is still felt in this new season, in good ways and not so good ways. But I think that Shooty's definitely found his feet, in my opinion. I feel like he's, which is funny because of the fact that they filmed this so soon after season one, as opposed to sort of seeing the response to season one and then filming this. He does seem to have really found his character. And I absolutely love his unapologetic, queer, slightly feminine take on the Doctor, and the fact that there's no... I mean, I'm one of those people that loves the fact that there's people that angers and annoys because, they're the right people to anger and annoy about that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think he's great. I think Varada is similarly... I mean, she's so strong immediately.
Yes.
I think that Millie was great as Ruby, but Belinda just feels so much more. There's so much more about her. Ruby she just instantly fell in love with the Doctor and felt slightly less dimensional, whereas Belinda has been unafraid to challenge the Doctor, which is the sort of companion that we need.
Just talking about Ruby, I do find the character of Ruby was a bit generic, really, at the end of the day. Whereas Belinda is just immediately more interesting. Loving the whole sort of pushback that we're getting all the time. That line she had in this, even, where she said about, is it the Doctor? Is it always just the Doctor? Ridiculous. Little moments like that are just brilliant.
And her sort of, what was Blink? Oh, it was an episode where you weren't allowed to blink. Oh, sounds thrilling. Or sounds like a right.
Was rolling her eyes. Yeah, I did love that. But yeah, should we dive in then to the episode? So we have the opening in the cinema, which on my watch today, I realised that the actual film newsreel thing that they're watching has got some nice sort of thematic links to light and everything that goes on when they talk about the explosion with the force of 1,000 suns or something.
Yeah, that was a nice setup because when Lux later on plays that same atomic bomb sort of film reel in the background to set up his desire to, want to have all that power himself, or that sort of the light of 1,000 suns or whatever, that felt like a good to set up that piece of footage first. Something I did notice in the intro, so obviously it starts with that newsreel and then we see how when it starts playing the Mr. Ringading cartoon, we see how he gets his powers. What's interesting is both, if you want to call this, season 2, both season or series 2s of Modern Who, the villain has been powered by moonlight, because the werewolf in Tooth and Claw was obviously, powered by moonlight. I thought that was interesting. And also the fact that later on the Doctor explains how Lux can be overwhelmed by all the light by saying, you're 60% water and you can still drown. And
almost a carbon copy of the same line, isn't it?
Yeah.
I do wonder, is it, a deliberate nod, or is it recycling at the end of the day?
Well, I think that's one of the things that's it's either a good thing or a bad thing with RTD2, because there's obviously the getting changed into period clothes scene that Belinda and the Doctor do that mirrors, I think it's basically the exact same shot structure as when Ruby gets changed. And that feels like it's, a lot of people I saw on Twitter are complaining that it's recycled. But I think that's obviously purposeful.
Yeah, it's a consistent type of thing, isn't it?
And then there's later on, a lot of this episode does feel like it's almost a repeat of Devil's Cord.
Yes.
In, again, some good ways and some possibly lazy ways. But yeah, what I loved about Mr. Ringading generally, but also the cartoon that he comes from, it was obviously so beautifully made. It had the title card that is very reminiscent of old cartoons, especially old Looney Tunes or Disney cartoons, where it's just his face and it's like, okay, this is a Mr. Ringading cartoon.
Yeah.
And I saw that the sort of copyright date on that is 1935. So it's obviously by that point, it's already about 20 years old or whatever.
Yes.
And it's by Dawn Animation House. I don't really know. I mean, Dawn, that's actually, I suppose, to the end of the episode, that's what he desires, that when dawn breaks and the light and everything. So that's probably
that's probably the reference. I do agree. I think it was very beautifully done and very sort of realistic. Like, you would almost believe that was a real cartoon from that time.
Well, it's got a lot of, as a lot of people have noticed, there's a lot of parallels to Fleischer Studios, so the people that made like
Popeye, isn't it? Yeah.
Betty Boop and things like that. Although there is also a lot of, just generally, it's a style called rubber hose, where the limbs are like a hose pipe in that they can sort of bend and wiggle all around and stuff in realistic ways. Whereas then later on, things like Mickey Mouse, they wanted it to be a lot more realistic, consistent lengths of limbs and things like that. But like early, like the Steamboat Willie and older Mickey Mouse cartoons like that, had that lovely rubber hose style. It's one of my favourite sort of styles. And so I think Framestore, the people that animated Mr. Ringading, did a really spectacular job.
Yes. Because I was wondering, later when he manifests outside of the cartoon, I was kind of expecting there to be a bit more of the sort of cartoon physics and cartoon logic sort of coming into the real world. A bit more like Who Framed Roger Rabbit sort of thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is, cartoon entering the real world. Roger Rabbit is the example of that, really.
Yeah.
And there was actually, on Unleashed, there was someone that at Framestore who also worked on Roger Rabbit.
Indeed.
And Roger Rabbit's got a special place in my heart because my uncle worked on it, because he was an in-between artist. So someone else did the key frames, the key poses, and he did all the drawings that sort of linked one key frame to another.
Oh, cool.
He never animated again after that because it put him off animation because of how tedious it was.
Oh dear.
And just became a storyboard artist instead. But yeah, he's definitely one of the main reasons I became an animator.
Yeah.
Is growing up having sort of him as a inspiration. But I think one thing that I did take away from this, as much as I did love it as an episode, it felt more like a sort of proof of concept, in that Doctor Who and cartoon stuff would work together really well. It just felt like they could have done so much more with it. But
yes.
I suppose you could say that about basically any Doctor Who episode, because they've got a limited budget. There's only 45 minutes. And the animated segments of the episode were probably the most expensive bits of the whole budget anyway.
Yeah.
I did notice when they were watching the Mr. Ringading cartoon in the intro, it became obvious to me more so on the second time round just how many times they cut away to the to the crowd, thinking
Yes.
that's a little bit of money that they're saved just there,
Yeah.
just having to cut away and just use, just hear it in the background. All the stuff that Framestore didn't have to animate.
Yeah.
But so recently I did a talk actually about Roger Rabbit, partly. It was about a concept from Roger Rabbit called bumping the lamp, where in one of the scenes, one of the human characters bumps his head on a lamp, makes the lighting change all over the place. And so lighting Roger became instantly way more complicated. But they did that on purpose, because they wanted to show off the cool lighting and stuff.
Yeah.
So they made their lives so much more difficult just to sort of show off, essentially. So I'm always looking for, the little details that most people might not notice, but animators still put in because they love the craft so much. And one of the things I did notice is when Mr. Ring-a-Ding starts to, he's just been hit by the moonlight, so his just looks is starting to take over, and he gets the cartoon turned suddenly more sinister. When he, Sunshine Sally is saying about the sunshine, and he's like, no, I want moonlight. And he gets more sort of creepy. His the pupils of his eyes turn into crescent moons. And just like as a little tiny detail there. But yeah, I thought generally the animation was amazing throughout. I just wanted more,
I know.
That's the only problem.
I do agree. I think it felt a little bit like we dipped our toe in and we could have got so much more. Yeah, very interesting. We got obviously the original song as well.
Yeah.
That gets stuck in your head. And it's funny how once it starts playing, he's forced to go through the motions.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of that he's sort of honor bound to reveal things, and he has to sort of play the games. And I mean, to be honest, there are some bits that were just very convenient. That, it was very helpful to the plot. But to be honest, I think there's always going to be people that want Doctor Who to be way more hard sci-fi and to be sort of rooted a lot more in science and therefore logic and things like that. But obviously cartoons don't tend to, one of the lovely things about cartoons is the fact that they abandon logic. And so it feels perfectly Doctor Who to me. I love Doctor Who to just, I don't mind the wishy-washy stuff. I just love that it's fun and, experimental and things like that. So a lot of those rules it seem like they're made up on the spot.
I think for me, I felt like it made sense with the toy maker because his whole thing is about games and games have rules. I mean, again, I could believe it for Maestro because Maestro was supposed to be the child of the toy maker. But then Lux feels kind of separate, and yet the Doctor was saying, he has to play by the rules. He has to do this, has to do that. Wasn't too sure about that, but again, you just have to kind of go with it.
I mean, maybe it would have been more fun if his rules were very much, obviously, like I said, that cartoons abandon logic often, but there's still sort of unspoken rules, especially in like Looney Tunes and things like that. The rule of you don't fall off a cliff until you've looked down. And then there's that brief pause and then you fall. Or there's even a concept called hammer space, whereby you can produce a massive mallet out of nowhere. And, people sort of suggest that it's almost like an extra dimension.
Yeah.
And that in itself is very TARDIS-y.
Yes.
So it's always difficult because the way that I would have loved the animation world to be explored, it's very much from the perspective of someone that knows a lot about animation and loves it so much. But I understand you got to make something that everyone can get on board with.
But you say that, but Who Framed Roger Rabbit is such a popular classic film. And that does a lot of that, blurring the lines between, real world physics and cartoon physics and stuff like that, which I would have quite liked to see.
Speaking of Roger Rabbit, something I did feel like would have been nice is to actually have the Doctor and Belinda physically interacting with Mr. Ring-a-Ding. There was that sort of convenient separation where they never actually touched. There were some points where, the camera did move and things like that. But yeah, it felt like, because the thing about Roger Rabbit and why the bumping the lamp thing was even even happen in the first place, is that all the unspoken rules of animation mixing with live action, from things like Mary Poppins and Bedknobs and Broomsticks, where you can't move the camera, or the lighting is always flat lighting, it never actually matches the environment lighting and things like that. Roger Rabbit decided they threw all those rules out the window. And wanted to make it look as realistic as possible. And there is part of me that felt like the way they did it on this episode was almost going backwards towards more like Mary Poppins and Bedknobs and Broomsticks, where there wasn't that interaction. But yeah, it would have been nice to see a bit more of like Mr. Ringading picking up real world objects, or at some point at least sort of interacting with the Doctor and Belinda.
Yeah, I agree.
That's partly what I mean about like this feels like a really great pilot of what could be possible in the future. But who knows? I mean, RTD's now sort of opened the door for this to be something that can happen within Doctor Who, so maybe they'll go further with it in future seasons.
Yeah, who knows? So you mentioned, the similarities to Tooth and Claw. I also noted down Idiot's Lantern from the same series. Similar vibe of like Lux is this like intangible being that has taken the form of Mr. Ringading from the cartoon in order to manifest and interact with the world, which is basically The Wire, isn't it? When she takes the form of Maureen Lipman. And so that was interesting. And as well, like the shot with the moon appearing and the moonlight coming down, it was a bit like the lightning bolt coming down to Magpie's shop. Yeah.
And then also, I suppose, seeing the faces of people like Rose and whoever else that have been trapped in the TVs by The Wire. It's obviously very similar to Lux's victims being trapped in the film strips.
I also got Torchwood from Out of the Rain. I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
I've definitely seen it because I've seen all of Torchwood, but I've only seen it once through. So I did see someone else on Twitter suggest that there was no character that comes to life in that.
Yeah, the characters come out of an old film reel, and I believe they also trap people in the film as well. It's interesting, the modern version of the show has been going so long now that it's able to sort of be inspired by itself in a way. In that, like, doing something in 2005 that harked back to the 80s is no different to doing something now that harks back to 2005. So we get one thing that we're getting more of that it seems so far in this series, which I like, is more time just sort of in the TARDIS before they start the adventure. More chat time, basically. We get to hear about Belinda's parents, and then the Doctor has his, moment avoiding being honest about Gallifrey, just harking back to Gridlock again, which was nice. And he builds that gadget thing, that Vindicator, which I'm guessing is going to be basically the plot device for this series, that each time they step out the TARDIS, that's what they're doing, ostensibly.
Well, I did think it was funny when he sort of used it for the first time. And then before they started the adventure, he said something like, we might need to land a couple more times to triangulate it or whatever. I was thinking that ticks off the ability for you to do a couple more episodes elsewhere and not go against the fact that Belinda wants to get home. I thought, again, that was quite nicely convenient.
I like as well the fact that she wants to go home. That's very clear. And she isn't letting go of that. But there's that conflict in that she does have that kind of like of adventure. I think she said, I'll go on then about let's go and investigate, as if like there is part of her that kind of sees the appeal.
Yeah, it's like, well, you don't have a choice. You can't go back yet. So let's just make the most of the fact that you have to stay with me for a bit and, have some more adventures. Yeah. And it seems like, by the end of the episode, she feels softened even more to be starting to enjoy it. But I do hope that she doesn't just I hope there's something else that rocks that boat a little bit more, maybe in the next episode or something. Just to, I don't want her to suddenly become again overnight like Ruby, totally besotted with the Doctor.
No, definitely. I was going to ask you something about the clothes changing bits, both this one and in The Devil's Cord, because I've been interpreting it as it's some temporal thing of the TARDIS. They walk through one and they get magically put into these clothes and they walk straight out again in real time. But it struck me watching it that you could interpret it as, they are just going back to the wardrobe and they're going to choose an outfit. This is just a stylistic way of showing that.
That's the second one, is what I've always read it as.
Yeah.
It's in the same way that you saw the actual wardrobe when Ten's finding his clothes in his first episode. I thought it was just, cut that bit out, and
Yeah.
stylistically you walk through one door and you come out the other. But that is interesting, that
It
the
could be
idea
either.
the TARDIS sort of dressing them, and that's why when they come out the door, that's almost their first time seeing it and seeing themselves.
Like, it would
in
be quite funny if he walked through with someone one time and they come out and they're like, oh wait, I'm not wearing this, what's this, like, or something, you know.
Yeah.
We also got in this episode a couple of music tracks from series 5 which were reused. One of which I didn't mind so much, the Sad Man with the Box, that comes up later. But in this little TARDIS scene, you get a brief moment from the track called Roman Paradox from The Big Bang, which basically features, it's just Amy's theme on a flute. And that really took me out of the episode. I was like, we're learning about Belinda's parents and stuff, and her wanting to get home. And all of a sudden I hear Amy's theme, who hasn't been in the show for 10 years or whatever. It seemed like a really strange choice.
If they went on a jaunt or something and suddenly you heard yeah, Donna's theme. To be honest, I'm not as I know a lot of the main tracks of the most recognisable ones, like the 11th Doctor's main theme and things like that. But when I heard that the first time, I wasn't able to. I didn't even realise it was a reused track. But
and that's the thing for the majority of viewers, I'm sure. So it doesn't matter from that point of view. But for those of us who do know, I feel like it. When you've got I don't mind reusing tracks in general if it fits the scene.
Yeah.
But when it's so specifically tied to a character, like as a leitmotif, it just seemed quite jarring to me. And that was something that I commented on that on Twitter. Someone pointed it out that, was this track used? And I replied and I just said, oh yeah, that did annoy me a little bit for the reasons that I've just explained. I then got someone replying to me saying, oh, you must be so miserable. As if to say because because that bothers me, I'm so miserable. But no, it's an opinion.
And also, out of all the sort of Doctor Who fans, for that to bother the person that sort of devised the fan orchestra, you've got such a strong connection to specifically the music of Doctor Who.
I do, yeah, that's true.
And it's one of those things that I think that as creative people, you sort of, as I mentioned about sort of bumping the lamp and Roger Rabbit and stuff, you value the details. Yes. And so it's when it feels a bit more like it's just been copied and pasted from, this sounds like it'll fit. And for you, it's just a case of like, this doesn't fit because this is about a character that is long gone. That's her specific theme.
Yeah.
That could have been an opportunity to introduce Belinda's theme.
Absolutely.
A new theme. That would have been the type of emotional moment in an episode where Amy's theme would have been used or whatever. But if it was her moment.
Thing is, with the Twitter thing, like, it just amuses me because obviously, the thing about Twitter and text-based communication is that you can't necessarily get tone from it. And, I just made a very throwaway comment that it slightly annoyed me. And someone's probably read that and interpreted it as that I then spent the rest of my day absolutely furious. Yeah. And writing a strongly worded letter to the BBC or something.
Yeah. Dear Murray Gold.
Yeah. What are you doing? But in all seriousness, though, I assume possibly the reason why it was in there is because when they're putting rough edits together of things, they tend to use a temp track of music from either previous Doctor Who music or maybe like film scores or whatever. Just the director will put something on to get a sense of how it's going to be. And I think sometimes they end up not using what Murray provides and they just say, oh, well, that worked. That track on the temp track worked fine, so we'll just use that. So someone's probably made that decision who wasn't aware that it was Amy's theme.
Yeah. And I think when you've got a show like that's been going on for so long, it does make sense that because the teams are always changing and it's not like when you get a job on Doctor Who, you don't have to go through some sort of crash course of the past 60 years of all the details and things like that. So there's going to be moments like that to us being something that, we're so familiar with. There's going to be people like us that know that so intimately that are able to go, that seems wrong. Yes. But to most people, it just sounds like an emotional track because he's talking about the fact that Gallifrey's gone and stuff.
Yeah. Anywho. What I wanted to move on to next is the way that the racism and the segregation was part of the episode. It's a very tricky thing because we don't want to just ignore the fact that racism existed or do like they did in the Shakespeare Code and just say, oh, just walk around like you're in the place, it's fine. But we also don't want it to be every episode focusing on it like hugely because we have stories to tell and we only have 45 minutes. So I quite like the way they handled it in that it's present and it's acknowledged, but it didn't dominate the episode.
Yeah, it's always going to be difficult, isn't it, when you've got two white people like us sort of sharing our opinions on this. I personally am always a bit unsure about someone like RTD, approaching these stories. Like there's a reason I think that, for example, Rosa in the Chibnall era, which some people love it, some people hate it, but at least Chibnall got Mallory Blackman to co-write it.
Yes.
It's always going to be difficult when such a significant part of someone's identity is being written by someone who doesn't share those same experiences.
Yes. I would say that maybe it wasn't handled perfectly, but just in terms of the balance, as I was saying about, how much it's focused on in the episode, I think it was a good balance for me.
Yeah, this isn't, like Dot and Bubble was obviously turned out to be one of its main themes was race. This race just so happened to play a part because of the circumstances of the time period.
Although I did think it was interesting that 1950s Miami was seemingly more accepting of them than Fine Time.
Yeah.
But all the characters they interacted with, they managed to, not have a problem. Although I suppose all those characters had their own things going on. Like Tommy Lee's mum was worried about her son.
Tommy Lee's mum was desperate and wanted help, and so her reaction to the Doctor and Belinda in that particular moment would have been possibly different had she not been so scared and just needed anyone's help. The guy that works in the diner, he seemed like he was quite young, so possibly might have been a little bit less. And also
probably gay, came across that way to me. So I was like, he's probably like, well, I'm no one to judge. We also got the nice reference to Rock Hudson and the HIV stuff.
Yes.
Which again, it's nice to have these things dropped in without pussyfooting around them.
Yeah, and it felt perfectly appropriate because of the fact that Belinda, would have had to obviously do some sort of module or some sort of class on HIV and AIDS when she was training to be a nurse. And so that would have been a perfectly valid scenario of her knowing Rock Hudson, and especially coming from 2025, with much better understanding of the disease. One thing I did like is when Reg explains why he's not just run away from Mr. Ringerding, and he explains his partner, Mr. Ringerding, sort of brought her back to life, and you see that lovely black and white film reel, and then she's black and white sort of dancing with him, but then forms into sort of full colour, and, it's a lovely romantic scene.
I also loved the song that they used over that. It was very lovely. The bit when you say, her figure was in black and white and then they turned and she came into colour. The first time I watched it, I was thinking, I kind of wish she'd stayed black and white to have that separation. But then I think when he then says, if you can't tell me she's not real, I think if she'd still been black and white, it would have been harder to buy that.
Yeah, because then that obviously lends itself to the fact that he accepts in the sort of the end sequence that I suppose it's just him, it's sort of him accepting that she isn't really real, or like that they can be together in the afterlife or whatever instead of this. Whereas, if she was very much clearly a film character or something like that, then it wouldn't have quite have landed the same way.
Yeah.
It would have looked cool.
It would have been a cool look, but I think actually it serves the story better.
Yeah,
that
definitely.
They did what they did. Yeah. So we did mention earlier about lots of callbacks to the Devil's Chord with this. Did you notice how Mr. Ringerding made his entrance through the curtain in the same ta-da way that Maestro came out of the piano?
No, I didn't link those two together, actually. There's a lot, later on, Shooty gets strung up by the film reel.
The film reels.
That's basically exactly what happens to Ruby with the musical notes.
I remember thinking when the film reels started snaking their way along, I said to myself, of course they were going to do that. And it is very similar to the musical staves, isn't it?
That's where it starts to feel a bit templatey in that it's a lot of these sort of carbon copies of things that are set up in things like Devil's Chord. And that's why it would have been nice to, I don't know, have a bit more of a separate, distinct sort of, Shooty's being harmed or trapped in a slightly more specifically animation-based way as opposed to just the film reels.
Yes. It's hard to know how much of it is deliberate, if it's like it's supposed to be a sort of successor to the Devil's Cord in that way, and you're supposed to think
it just depends on who you ask. It depends on how cynical the person that you're asking is, I suppose. If someone is in love with the new approach in RTD2 and stuff, then I'm sure they'll be like, oh, of course it's a purposeful, callback, and it's all very thematically clever. But then someone else may well sort of actually say it's lazy or something. So, yeah.
I was just going to say as well, Alan Cummings' performance doing the voice of Mr. Ringading was very, very good. He was an excellent choice, I think, for that. And again, we've mentioned Who Framed Roger Rabbit so many times, but he even sounded a little bit like Roger Rabbit in some moments. You know, the bit when, I can't remember what he's saying, but he does like the sad puppy dog eyes. And he says, oh, I'm all alone in the world, or something like that. And I thought it sounds just like that sort of thing. And the fact that he's got his own cartoon soundtrack as well.
Yeah, and Belinda points that out.
I love that stuff. Yeah. It's very funny. So also with this Lux, God of Light, that we're being introduced to, it makes me have the same question that I always have with these God episodes, which is, what exactly are they? When we say gods, what does that mean? I think it's just a shorthand, really, isn't it, to call them that?
It's a very muddy term, God, I suppose. We've not had like a clear definition of what actually that means. Are they just higher life forms that are more powerful but are still just different species, or are they outside of the world of science and biology and it's more fantasy? It's difficult to tell.
I think it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in that, like, they refer to themselves as gods and then we refer to them as gods. But it's summed up really with Sutekh for me, whereas like he was putting himself on a pedestal as a god. But I think by the end of the episode of Empire of Death, it was sort of the case that, well, you say you're a god, but what are you really? You're just a big dog.
But then Lux specifically mentions Toymaker, Maestro and Sutekh as if they're like siblings or part of the same family and things.
But they're not actually gods by the sort of definition that we would... Do you know what I mean?
Because Time Lords could probably like call themselves gods and demonstrate their powers in certain ways that would make people think that they were actually gods, whereas they're just more intelligent beings. And Sutekh was... I have seen Pyramids of Mars a long time ago, but I don't know to what extent Sutekh ever sort of described himself as a god in the same way that he's been positioned.
I don't think he did in that one. I think he was very specifically an alien from this universe. And then the idea being that he sort of evolved into a god since then.
But what does that mean, evolving into a god?
That's who knows? It's wishy-washy, isn't it? So, okay, let's get into the big moment. Well, the moment that could have been bigger. The animated 100%. Doctor and Belinda section.
The moment I saw this on the trailer, I thought, this is amazing, but I bet this is all it is. And it's just a shame that it didn't last much longer than actually what you saw.
Yes.
But we've gone from a Fleischer style of Popeye type rubber hose style all the way to Hanna-Barbera style, which is obviously really fitting because they had the moment where they said, you're Scooby-Doo, and he says, no, I'm Velma, and so they reference that, which is lovely. One thing I like is that as soon as that they enter the cartoon, both Belinda and the Doctor's, like, their voice cadence changes immediately.
Absolutely. It becomes super cheesy and superficial.
Yeah. Oh my God, this waistline is impossible.
Yeah, I love that.
And also the sort of the pointing is like so stilted, and that's because that's a style that was called limited animation. And Hanna-Barbera is known so well for that, of like doing as much as you can with as little as possible, of sort of only moving the bits of the character that you need to move, and repeated backgrounds and things like that.
Yes.
And then, unfortunately, this sort of, as soon as they enter the cartoon, they start to find a way to escape it, and you only see that one background. And all I'm thinking is what could have been, but that's just how it is. Again, maybe this is just the first foray into animation .2 coming together. Yeah, let's hope so.
Because I kind of assumed that once they got trapped in the cartoon, that maybe a good portion of the rest of the episode would be animated. And that they would be interacting in that cartoon world and trying to, talk to other characters and stuff.
Well, this is what, and then the Doctor and Belinda can start to learn the logic of the cartoon and start to sort of.
Yes.
There's so many more jokes of, like we said, about being able to produce items from just behind their backs. But then they did what they could with the budget that they had. Because if you sort of say, oh, this live action bit could have been shorter, then you would have had more time for this animated segment. But the animated segments are so much more expensive to do.
Hemorrhaging money, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I did see, I can't remember who said it, so I apologise, but I did see a comment on Twitter that resonated with me a bit, which was that it feels like this era of Doctor Who seems to be pitched at a younger audience than it has done before, if that makes sense. That it sort of feels a little bit like, I was watching it and I'm thinking, actually, this kind of feels a bit more sort of Sarah Jane Adventures than Doctor Who, just with obviously a bigger budget.
I do know what you mean. It's always difficult, isn't it, to analyse how, Doctor Who's this version of Doctor Who's a bit more childish. But it's always difficult to analyse that when you yourself have grown up. And so
it is. There's
always going to be a bit of me that's like, but if we were our age when we first saw Christopher Eccleston's series and we knew the classic season, we grew up with Tom Baker or whoever, would we have gone, this is so much more goofy and so much more campy and things?
Probably.
So it's difficult to say. But I suppose maybe that just comes with the sort of RTD moving towards the more fantasy elements than the hard sci-fi. That it ends up being, and it's always going to be difficult when you do an episode about animation and cartoons because they are just inherently goofy and wacky.
That's true. Yeah.
Obviously, you can have perfectly mature adult animation that animation is not a genre; it's a medium to tell stories of different genres. But Absolutely. of the sort of type of cartoon that we're seeing, it is that sort of goofy, childish type cartoon. So it's a bit of a difficult episode to be able to judge that on, I suppose.
For me, I think what makes it feel younger is some of the performances, not specifically from the leads, but some of the background characters and the worlds that they're establishing. I think back to RTD1, and I do feel like we had realistic sort of down-to-earth background characters that were coming in. And then you take someone like Tommy Lee's mum in this, I just felt like she felt a bit like a cardboard cutout of, worried mum. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think if you look back on like RTD1, it can even be put towards like the older looking visuals that make it look a little bit grittier, even when they're not meaning to be. There's something about like, because obviously it's Ultra HD on iPlayer, so it's 4K. It's you can see that Disney budget, as everyone always says, and the lighting's gorgeous and all these sort of things. And there's certain aspects of that possibly take away from the grittier side, like even the next episode's preview, which is meant to be like a terrifying planet, and it looks more like a horror type episode. There's something about that super beautifully, the spectacle of the Hollywood look that almost takes away from that. So it might even be that makes it feel like that, or probably more likely a combination of all the above.
Yes, I think you're right. That is definitely a part of it. Because I also noticed that as well when the show transitioned into being made in HD. Suddenly you can't get away with what you could get away with before in terms of costumes and things. Like the one that sticks out in my mind is Cleopatra in Dinosaurs on a Spaceship. I remember watching that and thinking, she doesn't look as authentically of the period that she's supposed to be as, say, someone in, the earlier RTD era.
But I think, it's probably like you say, a combination of all different types of things. And I've got no idea at all, because everyone seems to have a different answer, how much involvement Disney actually has editorially, or if it's just funding and distribution and stuff. So I really don't know.
So I think we need to get into the other huge big deal of this episode, which was the literal fourth wall breaking, where, you thought it couldn't possibly get any more fourth wall breaky. And then the Doctor and Companion literally climb out of a television set into a room of Doctor Who fans.
Yes.
So you may know, if you've been listening to the podcast, you may know I've been on this theory for a while about the Doctor being in a TV show and that kind of being a plot point. And then we got this scene.
Well, it wasn't even a leak as much as it was like standard reporting, wasn't there? three people have been cast by Doctor Who fans, and so everyone else that had the similar sort of theory of you suggesting that that's going to prove this episode is going to establish the fact that the Doctor is actually just on a TV show, and obviously in the end it turns out that it's the other way around, that they don't exist.
It's very interesting, isn't it?
I think it was a lovely way to be able to explore that idea and smash the fourth wall into smithereens, whilst also not actually going too crazy with, so that means that the Doctor's never really been real this whole time and things like that. It's suggested that idea, but then at the end of the day gone, no, we're the ones that aren't real. You are real, but we're not real.
So they were in fact a fiction within the fiction that just happened to mirror reality. And
it's, they really, obviously, they're all wearing merchandise T-shirts, and although it wasn't super clear, you could see in the background that they had the classic collection DVD box sets. Although I did see someone suggest that they weren't in the right order, which I thought was quite funny. I don't know if that's because they had some of the sort of reconstruction DVD box sets as well, or something that weren't quite, in the right order or whatever. And there was
someone just said, let's put them in the wrong order because that'll really piss people off.
Yeah, exactly. But it was quite, when you saw the shot of Ncuti and Belinda stood up about to sort of head back into the TV, you saw a poster from the, Ncuti's first season with just on the wall in the corner. It's a shame that all of that did remain very background, but it was fun. There was part of me that felt like it did seem to drag on a little bit.
Possibly.
But I mean, again, all I'm thinking is, you could have cut a couple of minutes off that and had more time in the cartoon.
That is true. But at the same time, given more time to explore that side of things, like I can imagine, like you say about maybe having more of a focus on some of that stuff that was on the set. Imagining, Ncuti going up to a poster of himself and sort of, touching it and being like, how bizarre is this? And, if that had been the focus of the episode, which obviously it wasn't.
There's so many things that, like, you could have had, they're stuck in a cartoon, or, they're stuck in the real world in which, he's actually stuck in this world and has to navigate the fact that everyone knows he's a character and things like that. There's so many things nowadays where it does feel like these are such great ideas, but they just obviously have a very limited scope of how they can explore them.
Yeah, it's been said before, but I'm wondering if we're getting to the point where a 45-minute standalone episode is not the ideal format for Doctor Who anymore. More of a serialized thing might be worth doing.
I mean, it's always difficult because on paper that sounds like, it'd be great to have more time to explore this. But as someone that has watched Classic Who from start to finish, the serial format does make you miss individual episodes. As is always the way with Doctor Who fans, we're never satisfied either way.
Indeed. With the fans of the scene as well, I just want to point out that they do come back at the end, which I quite liked.
Yes.
And it's open at the moment, it's open to interpretation, isn't it? Whether is that just a little joke or to give them a nice little happy ending, or is it significant? If I had to put money on it at the moment, I do think it is significant. I think it will factor into the finale.
And something else that I've seen people notice that I do think could be significant is, I don't know if you've seen the classic serial, The Greatest Show in the Galaxy.
Oh, yes. And you're going to talk about the three Ragnarok gods.
Yeah. So that's when Sylvester McCoy is sort of, meets them and has to perform for them and things like that. And I don't know if I can't remember the exact details, but it's something like that they want to be entertained.
Yes.
And so that feels very like, there's three people and, similarly wanting to be entertained. So that could be, they could prove significant.
Yeah. I think that's a very good theory. I think that might be onto something there. We'll see. But yes, when they came back right at the end in the credits, though, it's very funny because that first one that speaks with the sort of quite chatty sort of northern accent sounds like a BBC continuity announcer.
I thought that as well.
The credits start and she's like, well, I really, really loved it, and I'm thinking, and it even fooled me again the second time.
Yeah. No, I've had the exact same experience where I forgot that, it does cut back to them.
Yeah.
But no, I think that surely it does feel like them actually being real and still existing does feel significant.
Yes.
But then again, I mean, when I was here for 73 yards and we was talking about the significance of certain things and, they're going to come back in the finale and things like that. And,
nothing was significant. It was only significant because we made it significant.
Exactly.
But yeah, especially with Mrs. Flood, commenting on the show. Show ends May 24th, limited run and all that. Like, it's very sort of leaning in that direction, isn't it?
Like you said, though, the Mrs. Flood bit was a bit... It did feel like it cut to the credits so quickly. It was
very abrupt. So I noticed that in Unleashed, they showed the filming of that bit, and she says, "Trick of the light," and then she did a big wink to camera, and for some reason they must have decided to cut the wink, and just that's why it seems to cut in so quickly. But I mean, a wink there would have been great, wouldn't it? Don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I said this to you after the Robot Revolution, that at first Mrs. Flood's character, when she was first introduced, haven't you seen it? You haven't seen a TARDIS before? And when she's like Mary Poppins on the roof, I really was like, oh, this is just RTD saying this is significant. Oh, I wonder who she's going to be. And that's when I'm like, but it's not. It's only interesting because you're saying she's interesting. But then when she did the same thing of breaking the fourth, I don't know why it was, but in the Robot Revolution, when she's like, "You ain't seen me," and then she sort of runs off. Yeah. I don't know. There was something about that. I was like, actually, I'm a bit more on board with Mrs. Flood.
Yes. What I love about that moment is that it implies that she believes we could tell the Doctor that we've seen her and that we could interact with him. Yeah. Which is quite fun.
Yeah.
Every time she's on screen, I get excited though, because she's just so watchable and camp and brilliant.
So then, they're pulled down the film or whatever and fallen back into proper reality. And that's when Lux starts to... Well, he uses a bit of bi-generation energy.
Yeah.
Which obviously that's a known thing, that there's been a couple of times where 11 or whatever have healed themselves without necessarily sort of counting towards... I don't even know if there's a limit anymore about regeneration and stuff.
But that's always been a bit dodgy, I feel. It's always been a bit like, oh, you could do that. It seems that 11 particularly did it quite a lot. But with this one, it was like it was explained as sort of, it's a bit left over from the bi-generation, so it's okay.
It's things like that I think are good to, Belinda's new to the Doctor and needs to learn about the key facts, the sort of the 101 of the Doctor. Yeah. And so it's nice to have little moments like that where, there feels like a bit more of a reason to suggest it.
Yeah, it comes up naturally.
Whereas Space Babies, for example, felt more like a, crash course. So my name is the Doctor. I'm a Time Lord from the planet Gallifrey. And so it felt like it was a bit more necessary.
That's true, yeah. I also liked how she went into nurse mode and was going to look after him and everything.
Yeah.
That was quite nice. And then, as you say, Ring-a-Ding starts to become 3D and grow and sort of puff himself out and all that. Nice.
So I liked how you saw him go from the 2D to this. There was like a wireframe, and then even before he turned into a normal 3D character, he was all blue. So it was like a sort of, if you were modelling a character on the computer.
Yes.
He's not textured yet, so he's just all the same colour. But then it just keeps going and going and going, and that's when he becomes those like realistic, super realistic version where he starts to get a lot more terrifying. I mean, some people were sort of likening it to the gross ups from SpongeBob and things like that, where it was overly detailed paintings of something really disgusting. But for me, it was always more like when someone renders, this is what Homer Simpson would look like in real life, and it's always like so detailed, like skin texture and stuff. That's definitely what I thought of.
And then, of course, Belinda has the idea to blow up the film stock and let the light in, which is nice that she has that idea. We do then get that sort of classic theme that comes up a lot in Doctor Who, where a side character then sacrifices themselves in order to do this. I'm never quite sure how I feel about that, because it's sort of like, it's okay for him to sacrifice himself because he wants to be with his wife again or whatever.
Yeah, it's funny. There was when he is like, go, and then she's just like, what? And go, she didn't really sort of question it. obviously for the sake of the episode, it just needs to crack on.
Yeah.
But it does seem like, come on, there must be another way.
That's what I feel. I think that's what bugs me about it, is when the characters like Belinda in this case just sort of accept it and go, oh, all right then, you kill yourself, that's fine.
Because obviously I think the point is, it's not that he had to sacrifice himself. It's that he wanted, like you say, he was depressed after losing his partner. And so he decided that actually he would rather, because he's if we're going to kill Lux, that kills my ability to be with her. So the only way to get that back is to actually, supposedly be with her in the afterlife. But in terms of an actual, all of that aside, it is a sort of thing where you could have just lit a few matches, threw them in the room, and then ran away, and it would have done exactly. There was no button that you had to push, or you just were standing there waiting for it to kill you. So logically that was a bit funny, but then he's got the emotional sacrifice.
And then, of course, so Lux sort of disperses. It's a bit like the film is being overexposed, isn't it? By all the light being let in, and then
he can't control himself, and it's just growing and growing and growing, trying to get as much light as possible. And it's funny because obviously he's a villain, but the way whether he dies or whether he just, like he says, I become everything and nothing and whatever, however you interpret that. It's quite a sweet moment, which is a bit. It's a bit unexpected. That
also reminded me of Tooth and Claw, where the werewolf gets sort of released, and he says to the doctor, make it brighter, let me go. But that feels different because that's obviously the human who was turned into the werewolf is sort of a victim in that situation, and he can't be brought back properly. So it's just a question of let me go. Whereas this is completely different. Obviously, this is a god, a vengeful god or whatever. But yes, I think overall it was a strong episode.
Definitely.
What would you rate it out of 5?
I'm sort of torn between a 4 and a 5 because it felt like, I'm really pleased that they even considered doing an animation style episode, playing with the idea of animation coming to life, the obvious Roger Rabbit sort of, idea of mixing live action animation and things like that. But again, the animator in me is just yearning for so much more. But a lot of that was obviously budget and time constraints and things like that. So given the fact that you don't do 0.5s on this rating, I'm going to bump my 4.5 up to a 5.
Top notch.
Wow. Excellent.
And how would you rate it?
Well, for me, I'm torn between a 4 and a 3.
Okay.
I did really enjoy it, but I'm just thinking that I just suddenly realised that I am becoming that character in the end credits who says, well, I'd bump it down because blah, blah, blah. I think there was so much to love about it. But at the same time, like, Lux didn't really do much as a villain. It was quite static in that way. Like, it was very contained within that cinema. So it was static in that way, but it was also all over the place in the way they went to the different frames and stuff. So I did enjoy it, but I don't know. Do I give it? I'm comparing it to last week because I gave last week's a 4. And I think last week's was a more coherent story. But then I feel like 3 is too low for this one.
I feel like I should dangle like a pocket watch in front of the camera to try and convince you that it deserves to be a 4 rather than a 3.
Yeah.
But this has got to be, I've got to stay out of this one, I think.
It is tricky. I think if I'm comparing it to all of Doctor Who that I've watched, I'm going to say a 3.
Anywho.
Okay.
I'm tempted to bump it up to a 4, but I think it could have done so much more.
What only could have been.
Exactly. That's the thing, because I still would describe this as a strong episode. And I'm very happy with the start of the season so far with these 2 episodes. I just think there was more potential there.
Yeah. And I completely agree. I'm feeling generous, so a 5 it is for me, but a 3 for you.
Excellent.
So together we average a 4, so it's overall swibbly dibbly.
Indeed. And so this season I'm doing a quick fire question at the end. Can you name me your favourite thing and your least favourite thing about the episode?
I think my favourite thing, it's fairly obvious. I think just Mr. Ringadin as a character. such a beautifully designed character, such amazing animation with the rubber hose, and must admit there was an enormous sense of envy watching Unleashed and seeing the people that did animate him at Framestore as an animator myself. So, but they did an amazing job. And then the least favourite, I think, again, fairly obvious, is just the fact that they only scratched the surface with the animation. So in any way, the animation is sort of my favourite and least favourite thing, but for different ways. Yeah, maybe I'll make it a bit more specific and say the cartoon, because of the fact that I just felt that was so much less than could have actually happened if they had the time and the budget and stuff.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, me, I think my favourite bit was the fan scene, just because it made me laugh a lot, especially the line about, well, I knew this was going to happen because it got leaked online, and all that, just so meta and so like cheeky that they would put that in the show. That did make me laugh out loud a lot, so that's probably my favourite bit. And my least favourite thing, I'm just going to have to say that reuse of Amy's theme that was completely inappropriate.
Yeah.
I'll be writing a strongly worded letter.
Sack Russell T Davis. Sack.
Yeah. Sack Murray Gold. Sack whoever did the temp track. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we can talk.
Yeah. So as usual, I asked people on social media what they thought of this episode. Bad Wolf Archives said, this is exactly the sort of innovation and fresh ideas I wanted RTD's return to bring. And for the first time in a long time, I felt how I used to feel as a kid watching the show.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that.
Lovely. That is really lovely. For me, I felt that with the Star Beast, when Russell and David Tennant and Donna were back all at the same time, I felt that kid-like feeling again. But it's slightly waned a bit. Somebody called Benji Boodaloo.
That sounds like the sort of name that Ben would...
That's exactly what I was going to say, yeah.
Ben, and so Benji Boodaloo. Yeah,
exactly. Benji Boodaloo says it was beautifully paced. The ratio of villain, companion, doctor, emotion, etc., chef's kiss. If I was recommending Who to a friend, I'd suggest starting with this and a subversive ep for the range. If they don't like it, then Who's not for them?
I think that's a great thing, because it's basically, if you can't get on board with something like this episode, then you're not going to fare well with Doctor Who, because this is on the slightly more extreme end of the goofiness that it can do, and the sort of,
I suppose that's true,
suspension of disbelief or whatever.
Charlie says Belinda quickly becoming a favourite manages to make an episode about a god grounded. I would agree with that. And then finally, JZ1905 says, great Act 1 and 2 with some incredibly good music and dialogue and character writing, but felt rushed at the end. Wanted to see more of Lux just as he was getting more powerful and interesting. That does make sense as well. It did feel a little bit like they were cramming it in at the end. Well, 2 episodes in and 2 strong ones. It's looking promising for a good season. Yeah,
although I've learned within RTD2 to be patient and to not get too ahead of myself.
Yeah, well, we will see. But thank you so much for joining me and talking about Lux. It's been good fun.
Yeah, pleasure. And if they do some sort of other animated Doctor Who episode, that'll be my one that I can state my claim for again.
No, it's been really lovely to get your insight as someone in that world. So thank you for that.
It's a pleasure.
And I will be back next week to talk about The Well with another guest. Fingers crossed that's another great episode. But until that time, listeners, stay cool, stay safe,
stay fantastic.